everybody, it's Cathy and you're back watching the last session that we are going to do on Eggsactly. And we are going to do the bottom row today, which is the basket and the tulips. So if you come over here to my board, this is what it's going to look like. Now I told you before, and you probably have been working along with me, as you cut your strips, you're going to label them. Because as you can see quickly from my board, there's a lot of different pieces in this group and they are very close in size. So as you cut, label your pieces so they're easier to find. So the first piece we're going to do is our basket. And here's our basket. We're going to start with our background. And as you see, you're going to put your two little sides of the handle on first, across the top, sides again, and across the top. And that's how it all fits together. Then the basket, we're going to take our two alternate colors for the rim of the basket. We're going to cut our strips, sew it together, and subcut them. And then you will sew them together like I did here at the top of the basket. The big part of the basket only takes two little corners, and we've worked on that before, where you put the square on the corner, and you can either draw your diagonal from corner to corner and sew, or you can use a Creative Grid folded corner clipper, of which we have used a lot in this project. So then we have our basket, we're going to sew our handle on, and you have the center of your strip. The next piece we're going to work on is our tulip, and if you notice, the base of the tulip is made the same way with different numbers as our basket. So we have the big part of our tulip, our corners are clipped off at the corner, and we're going to do two pieces for the top. And that is here. So it's like a flying goose. You're going to take your background fabric, clip the corners off on two sides, make two of them, sew them together, sew it on top of your tulip, and the top of your tulip is done. Your stem, we're going to continue with using our corner to corner or our clipper tool, and we're going to take our leaf, two corners this time, opposite corners. And before we can sew it onto our stem, we need a background piece. So these pieces have to be sewn together and it will perfectly fit into your stem. You're then going to take your stem with the top of your tulip, sew it together. And you're going to make two. You can do it two different colors, or as we did from our chart, you can mix your colors around. Now, the corners are done similar to what we did in the first class, but opposite. So you're going to use your background, a square, and you get two from each square. So you actually have a 4-patch to sew together here, 2 and 2. Opposite on the other side. And I'm warning you this because as I was putting this sample together, I flipped it so I had my egg going in one way and then in the other. So just look at your pieces before you sew them together. You want the egg going out. Now along the bottom, we have our piece of whatever our first border is. And on our long white strip, we're going to do the corner to corner again. So this is your background and this is your first border. And as you can see, it's the same idea that we've been doing all along with the corner clip. Sew your border to the bottom of your two sides, sew your strip together. All the techniques that we are doing are repetitive, just different sizes and different shapes. When you sew that all together, then you're going to start sewing the different rows that we've been doing for the last few weeks. And I have a sample here. So now I'm going to take the new piece that we just did, the tulips in the basket, and sew it to the bottom. And then you'll be ready to do your first border. You probably have a method that you've been using for years, and if it works for you, great, and continue doing that. I do mine a little different, and I was going to share with you today how I do it. I want my left and right border to be exactly the same, and my top and bottom border to be exactly the same. And sometimes we all have little variances in our stitches, so things aren't exactly perfect, and this is the way I get around it. I take all the strips of my border, and our next border, which is actually border 1, I cut all the strips and sew them together on an angle, on a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to sew on that angle so that when I open it up, I have a diagonal seam. Sew them all together. So we have one big long strip. Now the thing I do a little differently, I go and measure each intersection. Now if you're doing a simple sampler, your numbers would always be the same, your blocks would be the same size, your lattice would be the same size. But because we did this in a row, the numbers are going to be a little different. So I wrote them down on a piece of paper, and always remember to include 1/4 inch in your finished block, because we still have our seam allowance on the top and bottom, so you have to include that. So on my strip on the wrong side, I straighten out my left side so it's nice and straight, and I also line it up on the line on my board so that everything's nice and straight. And then with a ruler, I mark it with a heat resistant pen so that when I hit it with an iron, it disappears and nobody will see it. But I marked all my intersections, and each one of these is going to line up with my seam of the row. And I did them exactly the same twice, my left and right. And you can see here, I have this one pinned on, that I lined up my line with my intersection. So if we have a row that is an 1/8 or a few threads different, in that 6, 8, 12 inches, we're going to catch it so that our whole border from top to bottom should be the same right and left. So I'm going to put my right border on, I'm going to put my left border on, and I'm going to then mark the same strips for the top and bottom border. If you don't hit it with the iron, your lines are going to stay there, and if you see, I made them the whole length of the width of my border so that I can use the other side to line up with my final border. And I will do the same thing. I take my strips, I mark them, I match up each line and sew them so that my whole quilt will be perfectly square. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little sew together here, and hope to see you next time when we do another one. Bye.
Now to quilt this basket, I'm only going to quilt the body of the basket. I'm going to leave the handle and the top rim unquilted. And the reason I'm doing that is so whenever I do the background quilting, I can quilt down the background, and that the handle will pop up a little bit and the rim will pop up a little bit. So I am going to do some free motion cross hatching in the basket. And to get started, I'm going to use the measurements from the top rim of the basket. So I'm going to put my needle right in this first corner. And I'm going to stitch straight across, but I'm going to wiggle it a little bit to make it almost look like a reed basket or a twig basket. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch down until I'm across from the next seam intersection. Stitch in the ditch up here. Stitch in the ditch. So all of my left and right, all of my up and down weavings are done, and what I'm going to do is now cross them in the same way, going up and down. So I'm going to stitch diagonally here, stitch in the ditch, and I'm going to wiggle my way all the way back up to the top. I'm going to stitch about 1/3 of the way up, wiggle my way back down, stitch up, and wiggle my way back to the top. And I'll make my knot. So my basket is quilted, and the handle and top rim will stand out more once I've quilted the background.